Hi guys, this is Ray. I'm Apple Valley Astrologer, just in case you are catching this on you now and you don't know who I am. So I'm an astrologer and I focus a lot on not just modern or, kind of associations that you would think of today, like when you're referencing your horoscope or whatever, but I focus on studying ancient religions and mythology and understanding how their perspective or their symbolism integrates with astrology today. So I like to reference a lot of ancient manuscripts, and specifically there's some people that are on like my other social media platforms like Facebook and everything that thought it would be a good idea if I felt like randomly just reading instead of just reading it to myself, that I could share the wealth of knowledge, right? So I'm going to be referencing a book called Moonlore, which this manuscript, and when I say manuscript, it's a digital copy of a book that no longer exists. It was printed in 1885, or at least this republished copy was. And specifically, this obviously I've been downloading some of these and reading them recently, but I'm referencing this one in particular because I'm going to do a live stream discussion later. I haven't decided if I'm going to try to do that on YouTube or if I'll do it on here or whatever. But I'm going to have a discussion on the origins of Easter and why there's the eggs, because I'm not saying everybody does, but there's always like the jokes, and I've seen the memes before. People are like, what the hell do eggs have to do with like Jesus' resurrection? They're actually very, it's very fascinating that they actually have a reason as to why they're both associated with Easter. Just because you don't understand the origin of the mythology and the folklore is why it seems totally foreign to grasp the concept that the two would be related, right? So I'm going to go ahead and just read some from this text. So here's some sonnets or poems that have been taken out of different like historical contexts and published works about the moon itself. And although poetry obviously isn't necessarily some sort of concrete dogma with mythology, it does give you kind of a psychological perspective and understand the point of view of what they attributed to some sort of form of subject, which would be the moon, obviously in this case, or at least like how they viewed it and if its importance or significance in their lives. So it says, I beheld the moon walking in brightness, and the moon and the stars which thou hast ordained. That's Psalms. It doesn't say what number because this manuscript's difficult to read. Some of the actual characters are unlegible. So who is she that looketh forth fair as the moon? The precious things put forth by the moon. Soon as the evening shades prevail, the moon takes up a wondrous tale. In full-orbed glory, yonder moon divine rolls through the dark blue depths. Queen of silver bow, by thou pale beam, alone and pensive I delight to stray, and watch thy shadow trembling in the stream, or marked the floating clouds that cross thy way. And while I gaze, thy mild and placid light sheds a soft calm upon the troubled breast, and oft I think, fair planet of night, that in thy orb the wretched may have rest. The sufferers of earth perhaps may go, released by death to thy benignant sphere, and the sad children of despair and woe forget in thee their cup of sorrow here. Oh, I soon shall reach the world serene, poor wearied pilgrim in this tolling scene. That was written by someone named Charlotte Smith. I don't know exactly what that's referenced from. I find that poem or, a phrase very fascinating in particular. So, shadow trembling in the stream, obviously that's glancing at it through like a lake or, the sea or whatever, which is fascinating because there's actually scientific correlation with the moon's gravitational influences on the earth and the tides, right? So even back in times that would be before a lot of modern science and ways that have been environmental science, how they've been able to prove, certain things affect certain things or whatever. They were aware just by observations, obviously, that there's some sort of significant change that's correlated directly with moon phases. And in fact, that's not a foreign kind of phenomenon with ancient associations and just, I guess you'd say folklore, because that's what most people would assume it is. But things that they understood or they observed about the moon in general, yeah, I'll just keep going on. Let's see, sheds a soft calm upon my troubled breast. So in astrology in particular, the moon actually is associated with the sign of Cancer. That's the sign right after Gemini, so it's like mid-June to mid-July. And funny enough, the like medical astrology, like the body parts that are associated with each sign, Cancer rules over the breast because it obviously is associated with the mother and the feminine, more or less, in modern astrology, and for the most part in ancient astrology too, depending on how far you get into the mythology. And then it says, that in thy orb the wretched may have rest. So there's the moon. The moon is supposed to, in ancient, religious associations, it represents, your primal urges or your sin. So the things that you are just urging to do, that's actually influenced by your moon placement in your astrology or your birth chart, in your horoscope. So obviously in medieval and ancient astrology, the moon was stigmatized as being that would inspire you or urge you to sin. And that's where the Lilith or Black Moon Lilith kind of association in astrology comes into play. She didn't really have too much of, an influence per se directly in medieval astrology, but in modern astrology, there's asteroid points that some astrologers use, and I use at least that one in particular. And so when you hear people talking about like Lilith or Black Moon Lilith, or like a lot of feminist kind of I wouldn't say feminists, but like people who support the feminist kind of thing, they're more inclined to be interested in Lilith because she's supposed to be basically a female rebel, more or less. Which actually, that ties into it. Ishtar, which is the Babylonian deity for Easter, is actually based on, it's supposed to be the fertility goddess. So it's basically supposed to be the hottest thing that every male, specimen would want to reprocreate with. And that's actually what Lilith is based on too. Lilith is actually based, every time you see like a fairy kind of, character, or like Sleeping Beauty, some sort of maiden that's, just wandering in the woods or whatever. And all those fairy tale stories are actually based on the demon called Lilith. Funny enough. So keep going here. So when it says, in thy orb, the wretched may have rest. So that's insinuating that you have the potential to go with sin or, to go with God. And then it says, the sufferers of earth perhaps may go, released by death in thy benignant sphere. So that's essentially going back through the fourth house in astrology is supposed to represent the life or the origin of where the life came from. So when it says, the sufferers of earth perhaps may go, released by death to thy benignant sphere. So basically you're going back to your mother, going back to God. And the sad children in despair and woe, forgetting in thee their cup of sorrow here. Oh, and I soon may reach the world serene, poor weary pilgrim in this pulling scene. Okay. And I'm gonna jump to, yeah, honestly, I just jumped to page 90. Yeah, I totally read 90 pages today. I'm just kidding. Let's see. What is this? Yeah, when I type in 90, that's definitely not 90. Okay. There we go. How's it going, people? Sorry that I didn't see you for a second. I kind of have to look off of my browser in order to read the manuscript. So if I seem like I'm ignoring you, I'm not ignoring you, okay? Okay, so I'm going to start with the section called moon worship. So this goes on about how, like, pagans and ancient cultures their association with worshiping the sun. So if you're familiar with at least like Egyptian theology, how they worship the sun, and obviously the moon plays into that as well, because it's a significant celestial orbiting thing in our environment. In fact, all of our months and days and even the hours themselves are actually based on the position of the moon. And we actually our farmer's almanac, or the thing that a lot of people when they're gardening reference and when to plant, is actually based a lot not only on celestial configurations but the moon specifically. So it says we have now to show that the moon has been in every age and remains still one of the principal objects of human worship. Even among certain nations credited with pure monotheism, it will be manifested that there was the practical of the primitive polytheism, which adored its hosts of the heavens. And however humiliating and disappointing the disclosure may prove, it will be established that some of the foremost Christian peoples of the world maintain lunolatry, Luniolatry. To this day, notwithstanding that they have the reproving light of the latest civilization, we are so prone to talk about heathenism as abroad that we forget or neglect the gross heathenism which abounds at home. And while we complacently speak of the march of the world's progress with which we identify ourselves, we are obviously of the fact that much ancient falsehood survives and blends in with the truth in which superior minds, or minds of the superior faculties, have been trained. How few of us reflect that the signs and symbols of rejected theories have passed into the nomenclature of received systems. Nay, we plumb ourselves upon the new translation and revision as if we were favored recipients of some fresh revelation. That makes me think of a Carl Jung quote where he says that it's not that man's demons no longer exist, it's just they have different names and faces. So basically, every generation, more or less, or cultures develop their own linguistics and their own associations, either symbolically or with language in particular, attributed to the same kind of phenomena that they observe in their lives, which obviously are a continuing thing. Let's see. Where was I? Not only in the names of our days and months, but also in some of our most cherished dogmas. We are but the liberal conservatives in religion who retain the old while we congratulate ourselves upon being the apostles of the new. That the past must always run into the present, and the present proceed from the past. We readily enough allow all the natural and necessary law, yet baptized heathenism is often heathenism still. Baptized heathenism is often heathenism still. So that's like a tongue twister. Under another name. Again, we are sometimes so short-sighted that we deny to former periods the paternity of their own more fortunate offspring and behave like prosperous children who ungratefully ignore their poorer parents to whom they owe their breath and being. Such treatment of history is to be emphatically deprecated. I can't read it because it's unlegible. Whether it arises from ignorance or ingratitude, we ought to know if we do not, and we ought also to acknowledge that our perfect day grew out of a primitive darkness, that the progress was a lingering dawn. This we hold to the clearest view of the divine causation. Our modern method in philosophy, largely owing to the novium organum of the scientist physicist Bacon, I can't remember his first name right now, and they're not referencing it, is evolution of the 19th century, and this process recognizes no abrupt or interruptive creations, but gradual transformations from the pre-existing types, variations under domestication, and the passing away of the old by its absorption into the new. Our religion, like our language, is a garden not only for the indigenous vegetation, but also for the acclimation, in which we improve under cultivation exotic plants whose roots are drawn from every soil on earth. And as Paul reached in Athens the God whom the Greeks worshipped in ignorance. So our missionaries carry back to less enlightened peoples the fruit of their life-giving tree, whose germs exist among themselves, undeveloped and often unknown. No religion has fallen from heaven like the fabled image of Athena in the full-grown beauty. All spiritual life is primordially an inspiration of intuition from the Father of spirits, whose offspring are all men, and who is not far from every one of them. This intuition prompts men to seek the Lord if haply they might feel after him and find him. This prayer becomes an instinct, and to worship is as natural as to breathe. But man is a being of five senses, and his contact with his fellow creatures and the whole creation is at one or the other with those 5 points. He is necessarily sensuous, endowed with nature and intelligence, and intellectuous, abiscus. He nevertheless receives this impressions on sensitive nerves. His emotions are sentiments. His words become sentences. And his stock of wisdom is common sense. So you see all of those Latin root words all meaning the same kind of thing with intuition or senses. The 5 senses. That's also too. I go to a lot of like cemeteries and stuff because I'm goth or whatever, and I like to take photos. And I've taken like my brother before, and he's made something like, why are there satanic pentagrams on headstones sometimes? Because you see like the multicolored pentacle, and it's not actually associated with satanic stuff. It's directly associated with the 5 senses and the 5 points that this book was just referencing. So it says, soon the sun, moon, and stars, as bright as lights, attract his eyes. As we have all seen an infant from a few days fix its gaze upon the candle or lamp, these heavenly orbs are found to be in motion, to be far away, and to be glory of the day and night. What wonders if ideas and images are formed in the religious mind? If the worshipper imagines the sun and the moon to be reflections of God of light, and pays homage to the creature which renders the Creator visible. Thus, in the childhood of man, religion grows. And within the multiplication of intellect and sensation, endless diversity of language, conceptual ideations of faith is the result. Another result, of course, is the endless diversity of deities. Every race, every nation, every tribe, every household, every heart has its own God, and yet within this multiplicity of religious literature and dogma, subject and object of unity coexist with the students of science, notes with profound interest. All nations of men are of the blood, and all forms of God embody the one eternal spirit. This is like the demiurge, or the omonism kind of thing, where everybody comes from the same origin. To this unity of mythology tends, as one writer says, we must ever bear in mind that the course of mythology is for many gods towards one, that is the synthesis, not the analysis, and that it is the process of the tendency to blend in one of the traits and stories of original separate deities. So if you didn't catch that, it says it's important to emphasize on synthesis instead of analysis. So that's one thing that like I have a beef with modern astrology, is that like with modern society today, everybody fixates so much on like very minuscule, irrelevant details with an individual. Like, for example, let's take holidays for since today's Easter. This is a good example. Back, obviously, in the holy days, in a couple centuries back at least, it was more common and it was a custom for family gatherings to come together and for them to essentially just enjoy each other's company and do like collective family activities or group activities together during holidays, holy days. But nowadays, it's, if you were to ask somebody like what Christmas represents to them or what they do on Christmas, more or less, even if people know what it represents, they don't usually celebrate it in that way. The kids are all about the Easter eggs today and how much candy they got. And on Christmas, they're all about if they got the right present. In fact, I've worked retail many years before, and the most painstaking, torturous day of retail is the day after Christmas when everybody's returning all the gifts that they were given that they don't like. That takes more precedence over just the sentiment of the gift itself. And yeah, so that right there in itself is what it's talking about. It's saying instead of focusing on the analysis, understand the synthesis. So understand the collective purpose and meaning and function of the collective conscious or the individual conscious, instead of worrying about one particular person, and their feelings all the time. And if they're having a good hair day, or they got the kind of soda they wanted when somebody went to a drive-thru or whatever. I figured I'd just use this example so I'm drinking soda. Anyway, let's see. The ancient Hebrew worshipped God as the eternal our righteousness. The Greek worshipped him as wisdom and beauty, the Roman as power and government, and the Persian as light and goodness, and so forth. Few hymns have surpassed the beauty of Pope's universal prayer to its, I'm not going to say that Latin because I can't. Father of all in every age, in every clime adored, by saint, by savage, by sage. Jehovah, Jove, and Lord. I find it interesting that they mentioned sage. Sage is an herb that is used for purification of, spiritual cleansing. Do I want to read this part? Nah. I see the word Christianity and I'm just kind of It's not that I have anything against Christianity, but that's the last regurgitated version of all this stuff, and it's just wow, yeah. It's like the telephone game that you play in kindergarten or grade school, where the first kid among the 20 plus kids says something into the person's ear next to them, and he has to go all the way around the room, and the last person actually has to recant and say out loud what the original message was, and it's never the same. That phenomenon doesn't just happen in kindergarten class, okay? So it says, the moon mostly was a male deity. So we have already, in part, pointed out that the moon has been considered a masculine gender, and have therefore put to travel a little farther afield to show that the Aryan of India in Egyptian or Arabian, Slovenian, Latin, Lithuanian, Gothic, in Swedish, and Anglo-Saxon, and South American, the moon is a male god. To do this in addition to former quotations, it will be sufficient to adduce a few authoritics. Moon, says Max Mueller, is a very old word, and it is Mona, the Anglo-Saxon, and was used there not as a feminine but as a masculine deity. For the moon was originally a masculine and the sun was a feminine. Interesting mix here. So obviously in ancient astrology and just in mythology and religion in general, the sun and the moon, the yin and yang kind of phenomenon of the dark and light, that's what those are supposed to represent, the halves. You need both of them essentially to tell time and to understand what season it is. And back obviously in ancient times and other cultures, it was imperative that they know when they should plant stuff and when they should harvest things, because that could depend on their ultimate survival, right? They wouldn't obviously have the luxuries that we do today with a lot of our, pioneering and inventive, frivolous shit, where we don't have to really be fazed by, environmental factors, more or less. Let's see. For the moon was originally, a masculine, and the sun was a feminine, and all the Teutonic languages, Teutonic. I've never seen that word before. And it is only through the influences of classical models that in English, the moon has been changed to the feminine, and the sun has been masculine. It was a most unlucky assertion of Mr. Harris made in his Hermes, that all nations ascribe to the sun as masculine, to the moon as feminine gender. Down to the recent times, our people were fond of calling the sun and the moon Frau Sun and Herr Mond. Oh, so that's German, yeah. Sir Gordon Wilkinson writes, another reason that the moon in Egyptian mythology could not be related to Bubastis, Bubastis, is that it was a male and not a female deity, personified in the god of Thoth. Oh, that makes sense. So Thoth was originally that's the deity for knowledge, right? So that's talking about like uh, relating some ancient cultures relating intuition to knowledge, and to having intuition is basically having some sort of divine information or knowledge, right? Does that make sense? It was also the case of some religions in the West. The Romans recognized that the god Lunus, and the Germans, like the Arabs to this day, consider the moon masculine and not feminine. Well, that would make sense why there's the moon with Islam, because they're not a huge fan of women. As were Selene and Luna of the Greeks and Latins. Again, the Egyptians represented their moon with a male deity, like the German Mond and Monet and Lunus in Latins. And it was worthy to remark on the same custom of calling it male is retained in the East in the present day, while the sun is considered female as the language of the Germans. In Slovakian, Sir George Cox tells us, as the mythology goes, the moon is male. His wedding with the sun brings him to the wrath of Percanus, the thunder god, which is Jupiter. As the song tells us, the moon wedded the sun in the first spring. The sun rose early. The moon departed from her. The moon wandered alone, courted the morning star, which is Venus. Percanus, greatly wroth, cleft him with a sword. Wherefore dost thou depart from the sun, wandering by night alone, courting to the morning star? Oh, so that makes sense. So think of like Romeo and Juliet, right? When he comes to her window, at night, and he's looking up to yonder, that would be him looking up to essentially the sun, more or less. And since the sun is associated with God, or the sun god, and Helios in particular, Jupiter being the largest planet in our solar system, it's also has ties to religion and dogma. It's seen as the god of gods. That's why it's associated with Zeus, the thunder god. So it would make sense that it's basically that continuous like fairy tale or story of the underprivileged kind of different I guess economic class of a man coming and trying to court a lady, and then the father tries to step in. Yeah. And obviously that's perpetuated through human behavior and cultures as well. A lot of fathers are obviously protective of their daughters, and that used to be something that was more of a cultural institution or norm that was enforced. And it makes sense. So you see how not only the mythology explains some of the relations to some of the like astronomical characteristics, but also it explains not only human behavior and the way that we interact with like social psychology, but with cultural norms and traditions that have been perpetuated throughout different civilizations through history. Let's see. Keep scrolling. Where the heck was I at? Did I write the page down? No. Ooh, wait. I think I'm stumbling upon what I was looking at originally. The moon is a worldwide deity. Anamorphism, or the representation of the outward objects of the form of man, wrought largely, as we have seen in the manufacture of man in the moon. It entered no less into the composition of the moon god. The 21st verse of the 15th Psalms contains its recognition to rebuke. Thou thoughtest that I was altogether as thyself, or still more literally, thou hast thought that being I shall be like thee. As Dr. Delitzsch said, because man in God's likeness has the bodily form, some of the presumed to interfere backwards therefrom, that God also has a bodily form like to man, which is related by a way of prototype to the human form. So this makes me think of the reference to the 6 days of creation and the ether spirits, how they didn't actually have some sort of bodily form. And this also correlates with my theory about how you can see somebody's astrology soul chart, and you can actually you can't tell what the gender is going to be per se, but you can tell if someone's going to project more feminine qualities or masculine qualities. And obviously, that's not that controversial of a topic for me to even introduce to people or talk to people about nowadays, since there's the transgender, transfluid thing that's trendy now. So I shouldn't get too much backlash for that. You guys should understand what I'm talking about. Let's see. Which, by the way, my theory with why some people, would be born a man, and then one person would be born a man and then feel like they're a woman or act more like, with feminine qualities or vice versa, would be essentially because their soul in previous lives took on the manifestation of the opposite gender. And because they have some sort of, sentimental attachment, and they like cling on to past experiences, like some people have that kind of personality in this life, on like a subconscious, like spiritual level, they would prefer to be that gender because that's something that they're accustomed to and comfortable with, and then the roll of the dice this time they were born as a different gender. And so part of them like has this like split within them where they feel like internally that they're the other gender, but they're physically obviously not the other gender. And so that would totally make sense with the whole anthropomorphism, that it could go either way, consciousness wise. Let's see. Mm. Where did I kind of skimmed through this earlier before. I guess I'll look on the window again and see if there's anybody who said anything. I totally figured I'd lost most of you guys. Not trying to be a butthole, but when I first got onto the site, all the people that are on the main page, or I guess that's the most popular channel, are just people sitting there doing absolutely nothing. And yeah, I'm not trying to like alienate myself, which I'm very good at that. So I mean, it's just natural. I'm not. I wasn't expecting a lot of people to watch this per se. This is more so I don't have to deal with recording myself on a webcam video and then basically exporting and rendering the file and then waiting freaking forever for YouTube or whatever to upload it. So it's just me a way of cheating and putting it directly on my YouTube already with the people that want to watch it. But it's like 30 minutes, so I think I'll go ahead and end it here. Anybody who I guess watches this, if this is something that you're interested in, I'm more than happy to continue reading on later. But I'm not going to. I'm not going to continue because I don't even know how long people could really pay attention to me. I know that the typical attention span lasts about 20 minutes for most people, which I'm sure that that's digressing substantially as time goes on. But a few rare people I know will pay attention to all of this and go, oh, just give me more. And if that's you, then tell me. Thanks for, I guess, the 3 people that did come in and look at this. And they didn't leave me any questions, right? Because I'll feel like an asshole if I... Okay, now. So, I guess that's it. And what does this do? Possible. Yeah, no questions. Okay, all right. Just want to make sure. I'm going to leave now. Are you sure you want to stop?